Alright guys, back in full color. Today I'm going to go over the RUY LOPEZ and specifically how Jose Raul Capablanca plays the RUY LOPEZ. Now I find older games a little more educational in terms of working on how we think about chess and how to play standard openings with your own thoughts. Now of course you can memorize opening lines and ideas, which are a little more important. But it's much more helpful to try to figure out how, once you get kind of a standard opening, how to find the moves yourself, or at least use your own logic so that you can follow through into the middle game and into the end game. So let's see how Capablanca does it here, and I'll just go over some standard ideas in the RUY LOPEZ as well. We see e4, e5, knight to f3, knight's out, and then bishop to b5. Now this is the standard RUY LOPEZ, where white develops the bishop to b5, obviously threatening to take on c6 and then take this pawn. Although it's much more strategic than that, because there's a bunch of different pawn structures and development plans that both white and black have. For example, the Marshall attack, where black eventually plays here and then goes for a kingside attack, versus something where basically players just trade off into a draw. So let's just go through the standard plan here. Bishop back, maintaining the tension, and then the knight comes out attacking e4. Capablanca castles, and this is a rather dynamic position where obviously black can take here, but he also risks his king and particularly white opening the e-file in the center. So let's see what happens. The knight does take, accepting the gift, and then we see d4, obviously trying to undermine this pawn, where if he took here, then he opens the e-file, and this knight is suddenly at risk of being captured. So black makes the correct decision to just chase the bishop back, and then solidify his own knight on e4, although after pawn takes on e5, this d5 pawn is a little bit weak, although it's defendable with bishop to e6. So let's analyze this position here really quick. So in the RUY LOPEZ, generally black is going to try to play on the queen side and in the center, and white is going to try to play in the center and attack on the king side. Of course, it depends on the position, but that's generally how it goes. The main strategic problem that white has in the RUY LOPEZ is developing these queenside pieces. So given that, there's many things you could do. Now, a standard plan for white is generally he'll try to bring his knight out this way, move the rook, and then he'll bring the knight here, developing that knight to either g3, e3, and then he'll try to bring this bishop out either to e3 along these squares, either trade it, and then eventually he can bring either the rook out or he can play a4. So given Capablanca's rather direct means of playing in the opening, he just plays h4. So what do you think black's correct idea from this position would be? All right, so in this position, black really should play b4, given the idea that when your opponent has trouble developing pieces and is rather cramped, not necessarily overall, but at least on one part of the board, and white has that on the queen side, he really should try to cramp his style with b4 and control these squares and not allow development. Instead, we see black actually make a mistake, not understanding the fundamental nature of the position, and he allows Capablanca to trade off and give himself more space. Now he has the open a-file, and he has rather easy development on the queen side. All right, so let's go from here. We see c3, and then black wants to continue his development. And now we see, all of a sudden, a tactical maneuver by Capablanca. So it looks like black can take this pawn, which he does. But the problem with that is that after bishop to f4, the knight can't return, and now all of a sudden white is threatening a fork of the queen and the rook. So how does he deal with it? The queen comes up to protect the knight. Objectively, the knight really should have just went here, hitting the b2 pawn, allowing the fork, and then he is an exchange down, but black would have a very active knight on c4 as well as e4, and he'd have some counterplay. But with this line, he actually opens himself up to another tactical shot, which surprisingly in this game, Capablanca missed. And if you want to pause the video and try to figure it out for yourself. So the move would actually be bishop takes. Now if the queen takes, we have this shot here of the queen and the rook, which actually would be immediately winning. And it's rather surprising, but Capablanca missed that. And instead he played knight takes on e6. Now the problem is that the pawn can't take. And if you want to try to figure out why, all right, so that would lead to queen check here on h5, hitting not only the king, but also the knight, and the knight can't move because it's pinned to the queen. So we played g6, then the queen would just take, and then he's up a piece. So instead we see the queen take, allowing bishop takes. And basically, Capablanca's idea, he probably got sidetracked from that tactical shot by thinking how he can basically open up to the king. But it's a little less weak, although it's still winning. Queen comes in, trades some pieces, and now this knight on e4 is going to cause black a lot of trouble. Although, objectively, if you notice that white is behind in development, Capablanca was able to use some tactical tricks to achieve his strategic goals. And in the Roy Lopez, that's a very common theme, where you're going to have to calculate a lot of moves. And specifically, I would say that's because the Roy Lopez doesn't necessarily trade a lot of pieces early on. Both players decide to make pawn moves on the third rank, maybe the fourth rank. They keep a lot of the minor pieces, and the rooks and the queens come out a little more slowly than, say, the Sicilian defense. All right, so we see basically the only move, f5, check. And now notice that we can't play here right away because there's a tactical solution. Say he moves here, then we actually have queen check, not only hitting the bishop, but threatening checkmate. For example, although he could go here, but let's say the king goes over, then actually we have checkmate. And now if he comes here, it would be checkmate there. And if he goes here, then it would be a smothered mate. Take, and then check. So there's all kinds of tactics you need to be aware of, even when you have a winning position, it seems. Instead, we see queen comes up, and now he's actually threatening bishop takes because the pawn is suddenly pinned. Blocking, and now he can't necessarily take, although he just takes, trades. So this is an important position too. It looks like black is allowing something like a discovered check, but you need to look to the end of the line. Again, tactics. For example, if white checked here, the king could take, but you need to see that the rook could take as well. And now if he took the queen, we'd suddenly have a back rank mate because white was not fully developed. Let's go back here. All right, so then we see c4, hitting the queen and focusing on speedy development. So that's another thing, is that if you are behind in development in the Roy Lopez, it is a lot of the times, at least in my own games I've seen and a lot of master games, it's okay to give up some pawns or even a piece to further your development, which is actually one of the main ideas behind the martial attack, giving up a pawn or even a piece to try to attack on the king side. Which in this case, white does have some attacking chances, but he's not as well developed or has as quick development as black in this position. So he sacrifices a pawn, hits the queen. Notice that the bishop cannot take because it's pinned to the king. Queen goes back. Now all of a sudden, white is fully developed. So it looks like black could take that pawn, but we'd see all sorts of problems with this king here and the inactive rook. Back. The threat was check, rook takes, check. Here, I'll just play it out here. Notice that the queens are on the same diagonal. Not that. The threat was check, takes, check, king takes, and then he'd win the queen. All right. Instead, we see the queen goes back. Now he's also hitting this E8 square, threatening to open. And now that's another cool move using tactics to increase his activity. He plays here. If the queen takes, we would see the discovered check, and now it works because there's no back rank problem. Takes. Notice that the rook can't take because of the check, hitting the queen as well. All right, threatening checkmate. Takes. And now after a couple checks, there's no good move for black. Now he could try to protect there, but after queen to g6, white's going to mate either way, and game over. All right, so if we go down and see actually the chart, we see how smooth this game was. And you might think it's because of the opening, but it's mostly because of the tactics that resulted from Capablanca's understanding overall of the position.
Come down today, always on my way. If you could see back time in the place, see back time in the place. See back time in the place. See back time in the place.